So it's Thursday, it's 4 p.m. and it can mean only one thing. It's time for a teissTalk. Sorry. I'm Renee Millman. I'm your host for today. I'm standing in for the regular presenters today. So hi to both Jenny and Jeff. Hope you're having a well-deserved rest, and I have big shoes to fill. As always, the talks are all archived, so be sure to visit the website and catch up on all the other episodes. Before we delve into today's news and discussion about leading a remote incident response and crisis simulation, don't forget we will have a poll testing the water of public opinion. I hope it's better than the water in our local river at the moment. And also today, the winner of today's most interesting question, comment or insight will win the almost mythical, highly sought after and extremely rare teissTalk mug. So rare, I don't even have one myself. I'm going to have to make do with this one. So keep listening and keep interacting for a chance to win that special prize. I'm also ably assisted by the Thais Elfa, who's working behind the scenes, who will send on your brilliant questions to our panelists and generally keep things afloat. I'm noticing a nautical theme here. So on to today. Welcoming onto our stage is our opening guest, Deborah Howarth, who's the CISO of Penguin Random House. I hope I got your name right there, did I?
You did. Thank you, Renee. That's great.
Thank you. That's good news. So, Deborah, can you tell the viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself, your company, and also a little bit of insight into what you've been up to, what's landed on your desk, and what your general approach to cybersecurity is?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Sorry, a lot to unpack there. I'm sorry.
So I'm Deborah Howarth. I'm the CISO at Penguin Random House here in the UK. Penguin Random House is the largest global trade publisher. Many of you will be familiar with our books, whether that's in physical format with our lovely orange spined paperbacks and other colours now available, or whether that's our audiobooks or our ebooks. So we're very proud of them. We've got a lot of intellectual property, and part of my job is to protect that intellectual property, to protect the security of card payments when people buy things from our shop or when our customers make payments with our contact center. Also to protect the security of our customers' data, our clients' data, and of course our employee data. A lot there that lands across my desk every day. We're an organization going through a lot of change and growth. And as part of that, it means there are many projects in the organization. They need risk assessing, they need security requirements for designs, they need designs assuring, they need new builds testing, and then they need supporting operationally to make sure that vulnerability management, for example, is carried out, and any incidents and data breaches or any other type of breach is appropriately addressed. So it's a busy old job, great fun. I've been working in information security for over 20 years now. I've been working in technical roles for around 30. And yeah, I love it. I wouldn't do anything else apart from information security. And I'm especially passionate about bringing more women into the field. So if there are any women on the call and you're remotely interested, give it a go. It's the best career in the world.
Oh, that's great. It sounds to me that you've got a full job on your hands there. So good luck to you, and basically good luck to any CISO. It's not an easy job at the moment, which brings us on to our news item, because apparently Tesco over the weekend suffered a suspected cyber attack. We don't really know full details. We've got this article here from Info Security magazine by my good friend Phil Muncaster. According to the reports, the website went down over the weekend, didn't come up until midnight on Sunday, meant that customers couldn't order things or change orders. And a lot of, obviously, with the lockdown, a lot of people are relying more and more on online shopping. Now, I've got to say now, Tesco's spokesperson said they blamed the incident on a third party, so they're being constructively vague vague
Only give
there.
me words,
Okay,
yeah.
I'm just going to say that. I'm just saying what their statement was. So really, so Deborah, as the expert here, I mean, what's your insight here? I mean, what's happened? What do you think's happened, and why?
Well, I don't think we'll know what's happened for some time yet. There was an interesting line in that article that I spotted, a quote from Tesco saying, someone tried to access our systems. Now, that sounds to me like some form of cyber attack. It may not have been, it may just have been a third party attempting to access the wrong part of a system. Who knows, really? Um, but the interesting thing about it is the disruption to Tesco and their response. And
It's quite a
um,
long disruption, isn't it? Really?
in the world of online supermarket shopping, absolutely, and at a weekend too, that's quite critical for their business. I would imagine they've lost quite a lot of revenue over that period of time.
Mm,
I do want to say some positive things about Tesco.
okay.
So at the beginning of the pandemic, they were hugely successful in growing their online operation, which was very important for those people that were self-isolating, were clinically vulnerable, for other frontline workers that needed to get shopping delivered because their hours meant it was difficult for them to get into the queues physically at supermarkets. So I think they did a terrific job. And many other online shopping supermarkets didn't quite step up in the same way, although I
Oh,
think they
really?
all they all really did expand eventually their business. Um, the interesting thing at the beginning of the pandemic was this introduction of the waiting room. So the idea that you had to get into a virtual queue to be able to get into the online store, which I noticed Tesco initiated again at the weekend, is really putting people into a holding pattern. It's what airports do when they've got too much traffic coming in for the runway. And they just get the planes circling to save a bit of time or possibly to burn off some excess fuel. And really, that's what Tesco are doing. Um, what
Yeah.
do we think about it? I mean, as a consumer, I think it's highly irritating. Actually, you get your shopping delivery. You're allowed to make changes to your delivery right up until the last moment. And a lot of people, by the way, have a tactic. You may not know this if you're not an avid supermarket online shopper.
Oh, go
A
on,
lot of
tell me, 'cause
people,
I'm keen to hear.
yeah, well, reserve your slot and put a few things in to get to your typically £40 basket
Uh-huh.
amount, perhaps a couple of bottles of very expensive champagne. And then nearer the time, when you know what your plans are, what you really need for the following week or month's groceries, go in and edit it. I'm wondering how many disappointed customers there were on Sunday and Monday being delivered two very expensive bottles of champagne.
Well, that's an interesting point. But like I said, when it comes to the cyber attack, it sounds to me that because sometimes it can be just like somebody misconfiguring somewhere in the cloud, and it all goes off. I mean, because I think Microsoft has and various other vendors have done that kind of thing. But it's very much sounds to me that this has been a an attack at the very least, isn't it?
Well, it sounds like that. Somebody's tried to access our systems, somebody's tried to cause disruption. It would sound like that. I think we need to be careful about making judgment calls until Tesco have done their own root cause analysis
Mm.
and their lessons learned exercise to get to the bottom of what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and what they're going to do, most importantly, to stop it happening again. And I imagine there'll be a lot of focus on that. And I imagine that their CISO is under an incredible amount of pressure at the moment. And this weekend would not have been a pleasant experience for them. Hats off to any CISO who has to deal with a breach in that type of environment.
Yeah, but it's really it's not a question of if, it's really more when, isn't it? I think it's going to happen to all CISOs eventually in their career, isn't it? That they're going to have to deal with a breach, and perhaps like an unpleasant breach from a hacker.
It is quite likely. You know, we do talk now in phrases such not if but when, and we really switching our efforts to focus on preparedness for breaches. So how would we respond? What would that look like? And I know we're going to be talking about that on the panel a little bit later. I mean, we should still take action to defend ourselves and protect ourselves where we can. But I think it's really important for organisations to respond well. And I'm not convinced how well Tesco actually responded to this
Why
event.
is that? Why is that? That's very, very, very interesting
Well,
what you said that.
I actually went onto the Tesco's website, tesco.com, today to look for their statement on this, to look for their public apology on their website, to look for updates to customers, to look for reassuring messages for customers. Couldn't find any on tesco.com or the specific grocery site as part of that page.
Yeah,
I was concerned about that because although, you know, we're becoming quite used now to having articles in the news about this organization's been breached, that organization's been hacked, and you know, we're becoming quite used to seeing that. But I would think for an online supermarket, customers may well be asking questions about the security of their data. And I'm not talking about how many club card points they've got. I'm
no.
talking about the masses of card details that Tesco holds. You know, that is something that a lot of people would be very keen to get their hands on, all of that card and financial information. And then, of course, there's the marketeer's dream of people's spending patterns, and how can we advertise them and how can we monetize that. So I would have thought that even though we're quite used to seeing data breaches in the news, this is one that consumers would be perhaps less forgiving about.
Yeah. So we've got an interesting question from Chris Pay. Maybe I should actually at this point maybe I'll bring in our other two guests to discuss this further. We've got Dave Cartwright, head of IT security at Standard Bank International Client Solutions, and our sponsor panelist, Chris Pace, who is the Vice President of Product and Content Marketing at Immersive Labs. By the way, thank you very much for being a sponsor, Immersive Labs. You know, well done. Okay, before we go back into the news, just first of all, Dave, just tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi guys. So my name's Dave Cartwright. I work normally in Jersey. I'm sitting in North Norfolk on Hulls at the moment, but I head IT security at Standard Bank International Client Solutions, which, in a sentence, is the offshore part of Africa's largest bank, Standard Bank.
Very cool. And Chris, can you tell me a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, I've been in cybersecurity for about, goodness, way too long. Actually, I'm not going to say how many years. And whilst I work for a vendor now, I began on the front lines answering phones for people who were infected with viruses. So that's where my career began, and now I've ended up writing and talking about things mostly.
Yeah. I know that feeling because I used to work on a help desk early on in my career, and basically it was switch it back off and switch it back on again.
That's it.
Which maybe Tesco should have done.
They should have done it.
Yes. Should have done here. Oh, nice segue. Even if I say so myself. No, actually, we did have a coming back to the Tesco's. We did have a question here from Chris Pace. Hi, Chris. It says not to rampantly speculate too much, but is this possibly the motivation for? Is there possibly a motivation for the interference? I think that's what you meant to say there. Well, I would say, it's the older bank robbers excuse. You rob banks because that's where the money is. I think I would have thought basically any data breach, they want to get onto the credit card numbers, don't they? That's the main one. Or isn't that the panel?
Well, that's Deborah's implication, and I liked it. I just didn't want to. I didn't want to force her. I didn't want to put the words in her mouth. But the implication to expand is that the interference is that the web server, particularly because it holds that data in the back end for people to make purchases and stuff like that, is the target. And I suppose a similar example would be the BA breach, where it was the back end e-commerce system essentially that was the real that was the crown jewels that they went after. I suppose mostly they don't want to break it. So I suppose, again, to rampantly speculate, perhaps the breaking of it means that it's less likely to have been an attack designed to exfiltrate, but we don't know that. We don't know that for sure.
No.
The language is really interesting, though. I mean, I've never heard that phrase, someone trying to interfere. That is another way of saying that you've been attacked, basically, but it's a clever, less sort of sinister way of saying that you've been attacked, surely.
Yeah. As I said at the top of the discussion, it does sound constructively ambiguous. You can read a lot of things into what Tesco has said. I mean, we just had the Twitter feed from Tesco come up, and I'm going to say this now. I'm no sort of nearer coming to any. I'm no wiser for reading what they've just said. It just said it's back up and running, and we're sticking in a virtual waiting room, which I don't particularly like virtual waiting rooms, but that's just me. I mean, Dave, what's your thoughts on all of this?
Well, the word vague has been used a couple of times, and I'm right in agreement with that. I mean, I noticed in the Q&A, Benjamin's just said straight up, does anyone think the public comms part of Tesco's response was good enough? Now, for incident response in general, one of the absolute core parts of incident response is the communication element. I've written quite a lot about this over the years. And if you're sitting on a train and the train stops going anywhere, something's broken. You're going to be a whole lot happier if the conductor's telling you what's going on than you are sitting there stewing for 20 minutes knowing nothing. And exactly the same is the case with stuff like this. Not least because Tesco as a public company needs to be telling people stuff legally.
That's a good point, right? So if people's personal data, their card numbers, etc., have been accessed, then they've got 72 hours from when the incident started to get that reported to the Information Commissioner, and we'll find out about it soon enough if that's the case.
Absolutely. And being Mr. Glass half full, if you within 3 or 4 hours can say to your customers, look, we've had this issue, here's what the issue was, no data has been compromised, etc., 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 that's a great thing to do. The communication doesn't have to be negative. I mean, yes, it could be doom, gloom and despondency if it is a really serious attack and something really bad's happened. But similarly, communication could be to tell the good story, saying, look, we've responded to this, we know what's going on. Look, no data has been compromised, here's the nature of the beast.
There's always
Sorry, Chris, go for it.
No, go. There's always an element of spin involved in so Accenture is a really good example, because Accenture, when the ransomware attack happened, came out very bullish and very positive about how they'd been able to catch what was going on and all this kind of stuff, and it was all very front foot. And then suddenly, as the story began to really develop and as the true nature of the attack became apparent, and in fact the attackers themselves began to say, actually, they're not telling you the whole truth here, here's the terabytes of data that we exfiltrated, their sort of over eager positive communications ended up kind of coming back at them. And I suppose everyone always holds up Norsk Hydro as the paragon of what to do when you've been attacked, which is basically full transparency, share everything that's going on, make clear that you do not capitulate to cyber criminals and all this kind of stuff. But even that doesn't show that you've necessarily got a handle on the problem. So all that dynamic is quite interesting. The bit that I find really interesting, and I guess the question for you, David, is if you're in possession of all the facts and a comms person says to you, what should we share? How much input do you have into that? Or is it just down to the comms team to decide how they spin what goes out publicly?
Oh no, I mean, that's a key part of the incident response, and that's why you have an incident response team. And most good organizations I've come across, the response team is not a cyber response team. Yes, you will probably have a cyber response team which is interfaced into if the response turns out to require cyber input. But the key part of your response team is the organizers, the administrators, the people who put the meat on the process and who call in the subject matter experts, in my case, the cyber guys. But the marketing and comms people are part of that team. And the running of the incident has that whole regular comms piece, because the comms is not just to the public, of course. Shareholders, it's to other stakeholders, it's to staff. Yes,
I do actually wonder on that, whether the timing with this being at the weekend could mean that the comms team weren't available, corporate comms weren't available for Tesco, because the comms was so disorganized. I would expect you're going to have your CISO, you're going to have an IT lead, you're going to have legal, and you're going to have comms working together to plan what you're going to say to whom. Any organization that's rehearsed this will have some templates readily available, some key phrases already legally approved to make sure you're not saying things that you shouldn't be saying in the early stages. So I do wonder, again, I go back to, I wonder how prepared and how rehearsed they actually were.
Absolutely. I mean, one would hope an organisation the size of Tesco shouldn't suffer at a weekend from lack of people for a significant response. But yeah, I mean, to your point, Deborah, the whole rehearsal thing is absolutely essential. Of all of the incident response stuff that I've done in most of my recent roles, the response, the simulation, the learning from what you did right, what you did wrong is absolutely fantastic, and it's always fantastically valuable.
So we do have actually a question here from Benjamin Davis. I mean, it says, straight up, does anyone think the public comms part of Tesco's response was good enough? I think we already know the answer, but straight yes or no.
Well, the bit that I'm interested in about that question is, where was the reassurance around safety of data, to the exact things that Deborah was referencing, the things that really the organization that finds itself in that situation you would expect to care most about. Like, we want to make sure that our customers understand that classically, your data is important to us. Like but they never actually, from what I could see, they never really said that. And they then, of course, did the classic thing. We have no reason to believe that any data was that accessed. And in some ways, perhaps organizations would be better to say, this is an ongoing incident. Everything's on the table. We're doing our best to understand what's happened. Well, as soon as we know something, you will know something through the Twitter feed, because that's probably the outlet that they have. We will continue to update you every X number of hours until this incident is resolved. All of that was missing from the Twitter feed. And to me, that's the biggest thing, because consumers today, they're cyber savvy, and they were asking the question, what about my data? What about my credit card information? What about my personal information?
Okay. And I think in general, one of the things that we were chatting about offline yesterday was just the wider piece about how open are organizations and how open should they be. And it's again, it's something that I bang on at length about, is we should be more open about stuff that happens to us and what we find out and what we learn from it, and share our experiences. And it's a crying shame that people are so reluctant to do so, because that one false word and you're on the front page of all the papers for potentially unreasonable reasons.
Okay, so coming on to the sharing our experience with each other, we're talking about today's discussion is leading a remote incident response and crisis simulation. And I think really this is kind of textbook what should and perhaps should not happen. So I mean, to kick things off, I mean, how do you plan for your colleagues' human response in an incident response playbook, and how do you prepare key individuals in the case of an attack? I'll just throw that open to the panel.
So it's about building what we call the muscle memory, isn't it? So that should an event occur, you've already got built into your responses some of those key messages. We tend to use the media symbols for our incident response. So stop, rewind, play, fast forward, play. We're going to stop. We're going to take a deep breath. We're going to look at what's happened. We're going to fast forward to the fix, and then we'll return to normal operation. So we tend to use that. Others use other ways of remembering it. But But the key point here, of course, is you need to get your senior people, your crisis management team, or whatever you might call it, you need to get them on board and trained up so that they are there and ready to respond in the rare event that a crisis occurs of whatever nature. And in fact, if you rehearse that, then when you get a global pandemic that comes and forces you to change your way of working, you can apply the same techniques that you've rehearsed in your cyber response or your technology failure response or your everybody's flooded out of the building response. You can apply the same principles. And so by practicing more and more, then you're going to get better at it. And of course, when we start with these exercises, it's always good to be physically in the same room because it's fun. You can make it quite competitive between groups. You can share ideas. You can use physical things like flip charts, overhead projector. Well, not overheads, but you know what I mean? Projecting onto a screen. You can display videos and all share in. But actually, you can do most of that remotely. And for organizations that have rehearsed in person previously, it's not very realistic because the chances of everybody being in the same building at the same time as a crisis actually occurs are very remote. So it is good to practice remotely. And we've done so, and we've actually done so during lockdown as well. But I think you need to have the basics in place because it's much more difficult to have those fun experiences which really help to reinforce the learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I completely agree. The other thing that I always advocate is to plan what you can plan for, so that when you get the people together, who've got brains, you've picked people because A, they're trained, or you're training them as well. But if you take the example of if you're the pilot of a Boeing 737, if you get an engine failure at takeoff and you're going faster than a particular speed, the rule says you go up. There is no decision to be made. You go up and then you deal with it just like it says in the checklist. That sort of stuff, in an instant response, things like how often do we communicate, who communicates, whom do we communicate to, etc., etc., etc. You can write that stuff down, because if you have the central organizational group running the documented approach, everything from the cascade list to call people out, that's all written down. No one has to think.
I love that.
Keep your brain power for the stuff where, you can't possibly write down every scenario. So you keep your brain power for the stuff that you couldn't write down.
And that's true muscle memory in some ways. I'm sure a psychologist would say the best thing to do is to do both, is to have those things written down and then to test to see how they play out. Because I'll give you examples of exercises that we've run. We run these sometimes at scale as kind of events. And we still get, quibbling over you're under attack from ransomware, your network is crippled, you're in the kind of colonial pipeline situation. Are you going to turn the network off? You still get an awful lot of toing and froing and taking of time over whether that question is going to be answered and what action you're going to take and do you have enough information to hand. All those things are all still at play. And actually, if you think about it, the playbook could tell you, it's a bit like your plane analogy. You're not hiding to nothing now. Just switch this thing off. You're not helping yourselves by talking round and round and round on it.
Yeah, completely right. And as part of your the documented stuff, you say, right, who has the authority here? There is an incident manager. A good incident manager will take advice from the people around him and then hit him or her, and then we'll make a decision. And that decision is gospel. Job done. And
I think, though, I do think we're ignoring the hardest part, and this may well be the part that Tesco found themselves in, which is before you take your action and implement your playbook, you have to verify that you've got a real incident. And wouldn't it be awful to take down your network when it was just a blip in your monitoring software, for example? So I do think there is there's that stop, take a deep breath phase, which is, have we really got an incident here? And is it of a scale that we need to invoke our plans?
Oh, absolutely. I've come across some organizations who have a pre-crisis concept. So, something seems to be wrong. Let's get a small bunch of people together to decide whether this really does mean a major invocation. I've come across others where the rule is you invoke it because they don't mind it being a false alarm. But similarly, if you invoke the incident response and it turns out to be a false alarm, no one should get shot for that, because it's a whole lot better than the alternative.
Well, I think it's really interesting. So that I was really interested to hear about the value that both of you see in exercising. It's something that that I'm particularly passionate about, and our company's particularly passionate about. But I think there are challenges today now with trying to make that work at scale. I think we were talking offline, David, yesterday. You were saying you just recently done one of these, and I don't know how frequently they happen. But we know exercises are really effective. Great way of bringing brains together. Great way of building muscle memory. But can they happen frequently enough necessarily to keep pace with how things might be changing?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, a fully blown exercise is expensive and time consuming. It's also, we've used the word fun, which perhaps we shouldn't be, but actually they are tremendously enjoyable. They're completely exhausting, but they are really, really rewarding to do. But you can do different magnitudes of exercise. So you can do a simple afternoon's desktop exercise, going through the documentation, who would have done what in this scenario. Or, I mean, I remember in a previous role, we deployed 56 people to the business continuity suite, another 12 people to the command center, and we ran a day's exercise with people phoning in, pretending to be the local paper, asking why we wouldn't lend people our disaster recovery suite. But you don't have to do a fully blown simulation every time you do it. But to Deborah's point, it's a really, really good point. The chances are you're not going to get everybody on the physical premises anyway, because people are not necessarily in the same place. But rehearsal is absolutely critical. And I see someone in a Q&A said, how often do we practice and how often have we done it remotely? Well, the last two I've done have both been remote and have gone happily very well. And
how about the rest of the panel? How often do you practice your instant response plans, and how often have they been done remotely?
So we rehearse twice a year, and during lockdown they've had to be remote. So previously we wouldn't have done them remotely, only because we didn't really have a remote working culture at all. Occasionally people might work one day a week from home before COVID, but most of the time, in common with many other media organisations, our business is based on people and relationships. So a lot of time in our central London offices for our creative folk, talking with other organisations, with agents, with authors, with events people. So a lot of physical face-to-face interaction. So it was a big culture shock for us to go from that to pretty much all our workforce, apart from our warehouse, working remotely. That was a big change. But I do think, rehearsing remotely is more difficult, and what you need to do is spend more time on the planning. So you don't necessarily need to spend more time on the rehearsal, but you need to spend more time planning for the rehearsal to go well.
Yeah, and the communication bit as well, because if you're in the same room standing around a whiteboard, it's a whole lot easier to shout ideas around. So you have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how you communicate with each other. Very
true. I mean, there's another question here. Is what changes have people implemented in their IR playbooks to account for the change in remote and hybrid work? I suppose you just had to get on and deal with it, haven't you? Yeah, in some ways it's got a little bit easier, because I would be very, very surprised if the number of business recovery suites going vacant over the next 5 years doesn't plummet like a stone. Because actually we've discovered, as part of the whole lockdown, okay, we may have had to rush about a bit at the beginning and buy a few more laptops and get a bit more resource in our remote desktops, or whatever we've needed to do to be able to send people home. We've now done that. And so, there's a lot of organisations that I speak to who are saying, well, we're probably not going to renew the lease on our business recovery suite, because we know we can just send people home and they can work. So I think things will change markedly, if they're not already, in that respect. And
I also think our colleagues in business continuity are going to notice a significant simplification in the plans, the business continuity plans that their organisations have. I think you're absolutely spot on that, you know, now we know we can pivot to work remotely, we will. Now, of course, the key thing that happens there, because you're not all close to each other, is your collaboration suite becomes critically important to you. So the way that you keep in touch with each other, the way you share sensitive information, it all becomes much more important. So it suddenly becomes more of a focus on the underlying technologies to keep your internal comms going than actually on keeping whatever public facing service going.
Yeah,
And I think that's the difference.
yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, but it's fairly seldom, but big telco outages do happen, and that Sod's law states that if there's some major crisis happening, well, maybe that increases the likelihood of the telco being affected by that. So you now need to start thinking about the diversity and resilience of the tech you're using by sending people home. But the whole thing does make me smile, because the example of the massive simulation that I gave a minute ago, one of the scenarios, as well as the office being flooded, was that we also got hit by ironically an illness where 30% of the staff were infected and couldn't come into the office. So that's actually a scenario that we rehearsed 5, 6, 7 years ago in a previous life.
Yeah, so that's a big thing in exercising, is that the building of muscle memory, or what we might sometimes refer to as kind of forcing cognitive agility in some ways, can be down to changing those parameters in a way that forces you to realize you have to work in a different way. And one of those might be, suddenly you don't have any email, you can now only WhatsApp each other, you don't have any access to your Slack system, or you don't, whatever it is that you use, removing the thing that you have seen as being kind of foundational in your internet hierarchy of needs, like email is there, and then suddenly you take it away. It makes the exercise more fun, back to your point, but engaging also psychologically is more effective. So that's why you do that stuff, and it tests how people think, essentially.
Yeah, completely. And to that point, the other thing that is absolutely essential to remember about the whole incident response thing, there is no right answer. There's no such thing as doing it right or doing it wrong. Obviously, the optimality of the outcome is a measure of how you did. But at any point when you're taking a decision, there's nothing that, I mean, sometimes it's obvious, but most of the time you're making a judgment call. Do I, to Deborah's point, do I take the network offline now or not? And yes, you can look back with 2020 hindsight and go, that was probably the wrong thing to do. But at the time, there is no right answer. So it's an interesting one to evaluate how well you've done and how agile you've been.
And that's the importance of the lessons learned exercise after it. And don't forget, and this is one of my big points, that every crisis or every disaster brings an opportunity. Hopefully not the opportunity to say, I told you so. But I'm thinking about a similar opportunity to be able to acquire that investment in levels that, to fix levels of risk that previously were assumed to be not likely to materialize, and suddenly they have materialized. So there's always an opportunity to learn and to grow and to further your defenses.
And I suppose the obverse, reverse is true. You might think there's something's going to be a bigger risk, and it turns out in an incident that wasn't a risk at all, and it can be changed, can't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the ability to think on your feet about what your risk landscape looks like is absolutely critical for any information security professional.
It makes me wonder about thinking on your feet. I mean, because another question I was going to ask is how do you ensure that your updated playbooks are followed by responders and the wider workforce as part of the continuity? If you're thinking on your feet, it's kind of the playbook, doesn't it get thrown out of the window slightly? Or
no, not at all, because you think on your feet around so the core team runs the playbook, so they deal with the communication and the organization and the administration. Yeah, they're the ones who will shout to people like us and go, guys, we're coming up to the 45-minute report to the shareholders. What do you want me to tell them? And so while the people who are trying to be inventive, particularly the IT and cyber guys, because they're the ones who are probably presented with an issue they've not been presented with before, while they're doing the on the hoof stuff, you've got that core team following the playbook and ensuring that the underlying organizational stuff, I don't want to use the boring mundane stuff, but all the necessary procedural bits are getting done, while the people like us, are having to be a little bit creative and diagnostic about it.
Yeah, I think Elena makes a good comment here. If the playbook isn't printed and only available on a network you've just taken down, and they're working remotely, it leads to people thinking on their feet, communicating creatively on WhatsApp. I mean, that's an interesting take on a playbook. If you can't follow the playbook if you don't have access to it.
Yeah, I think that's one that most of us have worn the t-shirt of in our careers, and it's one that you won't. Well, unless you're slightly dim, you only ever fall for that one once. But yeah, we have all come across the where's the playbook? Oh, it's in the office that just burnt down.
Yeah.
But it's a very good point.
It's the first thing we ever test on our scenarios. Right, you're in the room now. Please pull out your copy of the plan.
Yeah.
What do you mean you haven't got it with you? Yeah.
I left it on the train.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Thinking about exercising and a little bit to some other areas that have kind of been touched on as we had this conversation, but thinking about exercising, and I think it's been made pretty clear that, at some point you want to try to make exercising as cross-organizational as possible. One of the things we've learned from some research actually is that most exercises don't include, for example, comms people. Only 20% of the exercises that are being run actually involve comms people in them as part of testing the response. How do you, as the person who kind of is the evangelist for we should care about this stuff, how do you go about engaging the C-suite as well as the technical teams and maybe legal and comms? How do you go about kind of bringing everyone together and to say, actually, what, us exercising this stuff is really important. Let's find a way to make that happen. Like, what are some good initiatives for making that work?
I can't imagine ever running an exercise that doesn't involve the C-suite. I just, there's not much point having all your technical response plans in place if there's nobody there that can make a decision to invoke them. You need people with authority, the command and control layer. So for me, the key thing about C-suite is diary. Everybody's got busy diary. Nobody's got a lot of time. So we keep our senior exercises to an hour, 60 minutes, a couple of times a year. That's all you need. First one, total chaos. Second one, not quite as much chaos. But absolutely, our comms and brand director is a key member of that exercise. You've got to get the messages out. It's a 360-degree communication channel that we're looking for here. They've got a key role.
Yeah, communication is very, very important here, isn't it? Throughout the organisation. I mean, anyone got any sort of tips or tricks on how to involve the greater organisation quickly?
Sometimes you don't want to. Let's bear that in mind as well.
Sure. Okay, final thoughts here now. What's the key? What do you think the key takeaways here are when it comes to sort of incident response?
From my point of view, practice it, and particularly whether it's a practice or a genuine one, do the lessons learned. The lessons learned is what makes you better, and lessons learned can be learning that you did something really well and thinking, how could I do it better next time? Lessons learned does not have to be a result of something that went pear-shaped.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I was talking to a colleague recently who's in the military, who'll remain nameless because of what I'm about to say. And he said the military are fantastic at spending huge amounts of money on large-scale live fire exercises, but the lessons learned never really got turned into anything. So the exercise was fun. Everyone had a great time. Loads of money was spent. But what they were really poor at, it turned out, was taking that and turning it into what's the action that we have to take to ensure that the next time we run an exercise, or when, God forbid, we face an incident, we are X% more prepared than we were before. I think that's the whole point of exercising. Deborah used the phrase muscle memory earlier. That's absolutely critical, is that you're exercising for a purpose, and it should be to build that muscle memory.
And I would just add to that, the one thing that we often forget, which is if you have a real event, you should run your lessons learned from that. And that is actually just as good, in fact, better than an exercise. So if you've got an exercise planned in March and you have a real event in February, probably move your March exercise a bit further out. People need a bit of recovery time. So yeah, don't forget the power of a real event.
Cool. Okay. It looks like we've sadly run out of time today. I know we could talk for hours on this very hot topic. So thanks very much to our guests, Deborah, David, and of course, Chris. Jenny and Jeff will be back next week for another teissTalk. Jenny will be on next Tuesday to discuss rethinking your approach to insider risk. She'll be joined by Nick Harris, Associate Director, Information Security and Cyber Resilience at Oxford Nanopore Technologies, and Ian Brown, who's Group Cyber Security Director of Spectris PLC, and also Brian Reed, Cybersecurity Evangelist of Proofpoint. So be sure to register that and join in the debate. Anyway, thanks very much. I've been Rennie Millman, and you've all been great. So see you next time. Oh, sorry, before then.